The moment my daughter looked at me and said, "We need a place to stay, Mama," I felt something inside me go very, very still. Not soft, not warm, still. The way a house goes still right before a storm rolls in. I stood in the doorway of my own home, the home I had bought with my own money, the home nobody knew about, the home I had moved into 11 months ago specifically because I needed a fresh start, and I looked at my daughter's face. 41 years old, standing on my porch with her husband beside her and 2 rolling suitcases on the walkway behind them, like they'd already decided I would say yes. I hadn't spoken to either of them in 12 years. I said, "Come in. My name is Mildred. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as an elementary school librarian in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I raised 2 children mostly on my own after my husband Bernard passed in 2008. Bernard had a massive heart attack at 53. No warning, no goodbye, just a Tuesday morning and then a phone call and then the rest of my life without him. My son Calvin lives in Portland now. We talk every Sunday. He sends flowers on my birthday and calls on Bernard's anniversary every single year without being reminded. He is, as I have told him many times, the best decision I ever made. My daughter Renelle is a different story. I won't say Renelle was always difficult. There were years, good years, when she and I were close. She used to sit on the kitchen counter while I cooked and tell me everything. Every friend, every crush, every worry. I knew that child the way you know your own hand beat. Then she met Dominic Pruitt. She was 26 when they started dating. I remember the first time she brought Sunday dinners. He sat at my table, ate 2 plates of pot roast, and spent the entire evening talking about himself. His job in finance, his apartment in Charlotte, his plans. Everything was his. When Bernard's name came up, because Calvin brought it up, the way Calvin always does, easy and natural, keeping his daddy alive in the room, Dominic nodded slowly like he was being polite and then redirected the conversation back to a golf trip he was planning. I noticed, as always notice. I said nothing that night. I smiled. I passed the cornbread. But I noticed. They got married in 2015. I flew to Charleston for the wedding. I wore a cream dress because Renelle asked me to, and I sat in the 3rd row because Renelle asked me to, and I smiled through 4 hours of a reception where Dominic's mother was introduced to every single person and I was introduced to no one. I told myself it was wedding stress. I told myself she was nervous. I told myself a lot of things that year. The break came 6 months after the wedding. Bernard had left a life insurance policy, $180,000. I had held on to it. I didn't touch it for years because it felt like touching him and I wasn't ready. By 2015, I finally moved it into a CD at our credit union and told both my children about it at Christmas. I said I intended to split it between them when I retired, a gift, something from their father. Dominic heard that and his whole face changed. I watched it happen. Renelle didn't see it because she was looking at me, but I was looking at him and I saw it, this small, quick calculation passing beneath his eyes. Within 3 weeks, Renelle called me and said that she and Dominic felt the money should be released now, not later, because they were looking at investment properties and needed a down payment, and the timing was right, and Daddy would have wanted them to use it wisely. I said I'd think about it. Within a month, Renelle called again and said that Dominic's mother had mentioned I seemed cold at the wedding, that I had been unfriendly, that I didn't seem to approve of her son. I said that was not true. Within 6 weeks, Net called one final time and told me that she and Dominic had decided I was toxic, that I had always tried to control her, that I had never respected her choices, that Bernard's money was as much hers as mine, and my refusal to release it was proof that I valued money more than my own child. Then she told me not to call her anymore. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that, long enough that the room got dark around me and I hadn't turned on any lights. I did not release the money. I did not call her, and that was 12 years. In the years that followed, I learned how to be alone in a way I hadn't expected to learn. Not loneliness, something quieter. I gardened. I read more books than I could count. I drove to Charleston by myself one spring and walked along the Battery and ate shrimp and grits at a restaurant on the water and thought, this is a life. This is still a life. Calvin visited twice a year. His wife Denise is a good woman, and their daughter Harper calls me Grandma Millie and once made me a card that said, "You are my favorite old lady," in purple crayon, which I have kept on my refrigerator for 4 years now. I retired in 2021. The school gave me a party with a sheet cake and a banner and a gift card to Barnes & Noble, and I cried in the parking lot afterward, not from sadness, but from something I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or just the recognition that one long chapter was done. To buy a small house in a subdivision outside of Durham, new construction. Nobody had lived in it before. The walls were clean and white, and that backyard had a little patio with 2 chairs, and I sat out there the first evening after I moved in and listened to the neighborhood settle around me and thought, nobody knows I'm here. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe. I hadn't told Renelle where I was. She hadn't asked in 12 years, so I hadn't offered. 11 months later, she was on my porch. Old habit. When I don't know what to do with my hands, I make coffee. They sat at my kitchen table, Dominic with his arms crossed, Renelle with her eyes moving around the room, cataloguing everything. I recognized the look. I'd seen it in children at the library when they were deciding if they wanted something without wanting to ask for it outright. I set mugs down and sat across from them. Renelle started talking. She said things had been difficult. She said the investment properties hadn't worked out the way they planned. She said they'd had to let their apartment lease go. She said it was temporary. She said they just needed a few months to get back on their feet. Dominic said nothing. He looked at my walls. I said, "How did you find me?" Calvin told me. I made a note to call Calvin. I said, "I'll need to think about it." Dominic looked at me then, first real eyes contact since they'd sat down. He said, "Of course, take your time." And he smiled, this small, easy smile, and something about it made the back of my neck prickle. I said I needed a few days. They said they'd find a hotel in the meantime. After they left, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Calvin. He was apologetic immediately. He said Renelle had called him out of the blue, crying, saying she'd lost contact with me and was worried about my health. And he hadn't thought, he just gave her the city, not the address, but somehow she'd found it anyway. I said it's all right. But I was already thinking, the thing about spending 31 years with children is that you develop a very particular sense for when something is off. A child who comes to the library every day suddenly stops coming. A child who always asks for the same kind of book suddenly asks for something different. You learn to read the space around people, not just the people themselves. Something was off, not Harriet from the name list. This is my real friend, Harriet Bishop, who I've known since 1994 and who has the best instincts of anyone I've ever met, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her gifts. When I finished, she said, "Millie, do not let those people into your house until you know why they're really there," I said. "I know why they're really there." She said, "No, I mean specifically. That Monday I called a private investigator. I found him through a recommendation from my attorney, the same attorney who had handled my home purchase and who I had updated my will with the previous spring. His name was Gary Austin, and he was a retired sheriff's deputy who now worked out of a small office. In Raleigh, he had a calm voice, and he didn't ask unnecessary questions. I gave him Dominic's full name. I gave him what I knew about their finances. I said I needed to know what I was dealing with. Gary called me back in 8 days. What he found was not what I expected, even though I had expected something. Dominic Pruitt had 2 previous marriages. The first ended in a civil lawsuit. His first wife's family had alleged that he had manipulated her into signing over power of attorney during a period when she was being treated for depression. The case had been settled out of court. The second wife had filed for divorce after 18 months and had been granted a protective order. There was more. Gary had discovered that in the past year, Dominic had consulted with an estate attorney in Charlotte, not for his own estate planning, but asking questions contesting wills, about what constituted undue influence, about how to establish residency in a parent's home, and what rights that created. I read Gary's written report 3 times sitting at my kitchen table. Then I put it in a folder, and I put the folder in the bottom of a box in my closet, and I sat for a while with the particular feeling you get when something you feared turns out to be true. It's not satisfying. People think it would be. It isn't. Then I picked up the phone and I called Renelle, and I told her they could come stay for a month while they sorted things out. They moved in on a Friday. I had already spoken to my attorney. I had already changed the passwords on my financial accounts and enabled 2-factor authentication on everything. I had already moved the majority of my savings to an account at a credit union I'd never mentioned to anyone in my family, and I had transferred the deed update my attorney had suggested into a living trust where the house could not be touched without specific legal process. I had also called Calvin and explained everything to him and asked him to be available by phone, and I had asked Gary to keep working. Living with them was strange, not explosive, strange. Dominic was pleasant in a way that felt like a performance. He would bring in groceries without being asked. He would compliment my cooking. He held doors. It was the behavior of someone who had decided to be likable, which is different from someone who simply is. Renelle was harder to read. There were moments, small ones, where I glimpsed my daughter. She helped me pull weeds in the backyard one Saturday morning, and for about 20 minutes it was like 2003 again, just the 2 of us with dirt on our hands talking about nothing important. Then Dominic came to the back door and called her name, and something in her face shifted, and she stood up and went inside. I stayed in the garden a little longer. At night, I could hear them talking in the guest room. Not the words, just the rhythm of it. Dominic talking more, Renelle quieter. The sound of a conversation where one person is always explaining, and the other is always being convinced. 3 weeks in, Gary called me with new information. Dominic had reached out to a notary in Durham. He had asked, through an intermediary, Gary explained a mutual contact about the process for witnessing signatures from elderly individuals and whether remote notarization was recognized in North Carolina. I thanked Gary. I hung up. I called my attorney. Here is the thing I want to say about what happened next, because I've thought about it many times since. I was not angry. I want to be precise about that. There was a moment when I might have become angry, when I first understood fully what Dominic was trying to do, what he had been planning from the moment he heard the word inheritance at my kitchen table all those years ago. And in that moment I felt something rise up in me, hot and fast, but I let it pass. Because anger is not useful when what you need is clarity. I had dinner ready at 6:30 the following Friday. Chicken peccata, roasted potatoes, green beans from the garden. I lit the candles I usually save for special occasions. I poured sweet tea. We sat down. We said grace. I said grace, which I always do in my own home, and Dominic sat quietly through it the way he always did, respectful in the specific way of someone who doesn't believe in what they're respecting. After dinner, I said I had something I wanted to talk about. I said I'd been thinking about getting my affairs in order. I said I'd been feeling my age lately, my knees, my back, the general sense that things were more fragile than they used to be. I said I thought it might be a good idea to update some of my documents. I watched Dominic's face very carefully. He said, "That's wise, Mama Mildred." He'd started calling me that, Mama Mildred. I had not asked him to. I said I'd be meeting with my attorney the following week and that I might need a witness for some paperwork. He said, of course, whatever I needed. I said, thank you. I poured more tea. What I did not say was that my attorney was also a notary, or that Gary Austin would be present at that meeting, or that I had spent the previous afternoon at the Durham County Sheriff's Office with a folder full of documents and a very detailed account of what I believed was being planned in the guest room of my own home. My attorney's Miss Reginald Faust. He's been practicing in the Research Triangle for 30 years, and he has a quality I have always admired in people. He does not get excited when he should be calm. He went through Gary's report methodically. He listened to everything I said. He made calls while I sat in his waiting room with a cup of coffee and a magazine I didn't read. When he came back out, he sat across from me and said, "Mildred, you handled this exactly right." He explained what the sheriff's office would need. He explained the timeline. He told me that given Dominic's prior civil case and the specific nature of what Gary had documented, there was a reasonable basis for the detectives to open an inquiry. I said, "And my daughter?" He paused. He said, "That's a harder question. There's no evidence she's participated actively in the planning. But you know your daughter better than I do." I thought about the 20 minutes in the garden. I thought about the way her face shifted when Dominic called her name. I said, "She's not the one who started this, but she's been here long enough to know." He nodded. It happened on a Wednesday morning. I had gone out early. I told them I had a doctor's appointment. I drove to Reginald's office and sat there with coffee and a crossword puzzle I did not finish. 2 detectives went to the house at 10 in the morning. They had a warrant to search Dominic's devices based on evidence Gary had documented of the communications with the notary and the estate attorney, combined with the information from his first wife's family, who had agreed to speak with law enforcement when contacted. I was not there to see it. I chose not to be. Reginald called me at 11:15. He said they had taken Dominic in for questioning. He said there would likely be charges. Elder financial abuse was what the detectives had indicated, along with fraud-related counts depending on what the devices showed. I drove home. Renelle was sitting on my front porch when I pulled up. She didn't have her phone. She didn't have her purse. She was just sitting there in the morning sun with her hands in her lap, and she looked, for the first time in a long time, like a person instead of a performance. I parked. I sat in the car for a moment. Then I got out and walked up the path and sat down in the chair beside her. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "How long did you know?" I said, "Long enough." She started to cry, not dramatically, quietly, the way people cry when they've run out of the energy it takes together. She said, "Mama, I didn't." And then she stopped, started again. I knew something was wrong. I knew it for a long time. I didn't know how to. I said, "I know," she said. "Are you going to forgive me?" I thought about that. I thought about 12 years. I thought about the phone call where she told me I was toxic. I thought about Sunday dinners I had eaten alone and holidays I had navigated around and the way I had learned, slowly and painfully, to build a life that didn't have a hole shaped like my daughter in it. I said, "I don't know yet, but I'm sitting here with you, aren't I?" She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. We sat there together in the morning quiet, 2 women on a porch, neither of us saying much, And somewhere in the neighborhood, a lawnmower started up and a dog barked twice, and then everything went still again. I didn't promise her anything that day. I didn't say it would be easy, or that I had forgotten, or that everything was fine. Those would have been lies, and I have been done with comfortable lies for a long time. What I said eventually was this. I said, "You are going to have to do some real work, Ranelle. Not for me, for yourself. You are going to have to figure out how you ended up here, sitting on your mother's porch with a man in custody who you let make decisions for you for 12 years. You're going to have to sit with that," she said. "I know," I said, "and when you're ready, when you've actually done that work, I'll be here." She nodded again, smaller this time. I went inside and put on a pot of coffee and stood at my kitchen window and looked at my backyard, at the little patio with the 2 chairs, at the garden that was just starting to come in properly after 2 seasons of work. I had bought this house because I needed a place that was only mine. No history in the walls, no grief soaked into the floors, no weight of other choices pressing down on every room, just clean where things grew because I tended them. It was still that. Even after everything, it was still that. The coffee finished. I poured a cup. I stood there in my kitchen in the morning light, 67 years old, and I thought about Bernard. I always think about Bernard, and I thought he would have Hindelays and worse in others. He was a man who led with his heart before his head, which was a beautiful quality and occasionally a costly one. But he would have been proud of me. I know that the way I know my own name. I picked up my phone and called Calvin. He answered on the second ring, the way he always does, and I could hear Harper in the background about something, and he said, "Mama, how are you?" I said, "I'm all right, baby. I'm all right." And I meant it, not as a shorthand for fine, not as a way of closing the subject, but as a real, considered answer to a real question. I was all right. I was in my own house with my garden coming in and my coffee hot and my accounts intact and my name on a deed in a living trust that nobody could touch. I was 67 years old and I was still standing. That, it turned out, was enough.